The flags of 47 species hung from the ceiling of the grand atrium aboard the diplomatic station Celestine Meridian, each one swaying gently in the recycled air that smelled of too many worlds mixed together. And among all those banners, two mattered more than the rest: the deep blue flag of the Terran Confederation and the sharp crimson standard of the Velkari Dominion. Commander Jonah Mercer stood 3 steps behind Ambassador Lian Zhao, his hands clasped behind his back. His dress uniform pressed so clean it could have fooled anyone into thinking he was just another politician. But his eyes told a different story. They moved across the room the way a soldier's eyes always moved, checking corners, counting exits, watching hands. The war had lasted 12 years. 12 years of burning colonies and shattered fleets and names on memorial walls that stretched longer than any speech could honor. And now it was supposed to end here, in this room, with signatures and handshakes and words about peace that Mercer had heard too many times before. Ambassador Zhao stepped forward to the podium and the room fell silent, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. She had spent 3 years negotiating this treaty, 3 years of sleepless nights and back-channel talks and moments where the whole thing almost collapsed. And now she stood before the galaxy with steady hands and a voice that did not shake. "We did not come to this table because we are tired of fighting," she said, and her words carried across the atrium like something sacred. "We came because we remember what we are fighting for: not territory, not pride, not the right to say we won. We came because every life lost in the HFY Wars was a life that deserved to grow old, and we owe it to them to try." The applause that followed was genuine from some and polite from others, and Mercer watched it all with the same quiet expression he had worn since the shuttle docked that morning. Across the atrium, the Velkari delegation stood in perfect formation, tall insectoid beings with crystalline exoskeletons that caught the light and split it into colors that human eyes could barely name. And at their center stood Archon Veltharis, their leader for this occasion, ancient and regal and looking at humanity the way someone might look at a child who had wandered into a room full of adults. Veltharis stepped forward and raised all 4 of his arms in the traditional gesture of the Velkari peace rite, and the members of his delegation followed, their crystalline bodies humming with a low resonance that filled the room like a hymn. "We speak the vow of eternal stillness," Veltharis announced, his translated voice deep and smooth. "No blade shall be drawn, no fire shall be cast, no blood shall be spilled between our peoples from this moment until the stars themselves go dark." It was beautiful, Mercer admitted to himself, and that was exactly what bothered him. He had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous lies were the ones wrapped in beauty. The signing took place on a table carved from wood that had been grown on Earth and crystal that had been mined on Kethvar, the Velkari homeworld. A symbol of unity, the diplomats called it, and Mercer called it a very expensive desk, but he kept that thought to himself. Ambassador Zhao signed first, her pen moving with the kind of careful grace that said she understood the weight of every letter. And then Veltharis pressed his claw into the crystalline seal beside her name, and the accord of tranquil stars was born. The room erupted in applause, and the cameras broadcast the moment to every corner of the galaxy, and for one shining instant it almost felt real. Almost. Mercer waited until the ceremony moved into the banquet phase before he slipped away from the crowd and made his way to an observation deck on the upper ring of the station. And from there, he could see the stars and the ships, dozens of them from dozens of species, all gathered to witness history. But his eyes were not on the neutral vessels. They were on the Velkari warships sitting in a tight formation just beyond the station's perimeter, and every single one of them still had its weapon arrays powered and glowing a faint violet against the black of space. He pulled up his datapad and checked the treaty language one more time. Article 7, Section 3, clear and immediate. All military vessels within the designated neutral zone shall power down offensive systems within 1 standard hour of the signing. It had been 3 hours. Mercer walked back inside and found Zhao at the edge of the banquet hall, smiling and shaking hands with a delegation of amphibian traders from the Rithik Combine, and he waited until she had a moment before he leaned in close. "Their ships haven't powered down," he said quietly. Zhao's smile did not change, but her eyes did, just for a second, just enough for him to see that she heard him. "It could be a technical delay," she said. "Their systems are different from ours. Give it time, Jonah." "I've given it 3 hours. "Then give it 3 more, she said, and her voice was kind but firm. "Peace requires vulnerability. If we start pointing fingers on the first night, we lose everything we built." He wanted to argue, but he respected her too much to do it here. So he nodded and stepped back into the crowd and kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. The banquet was loud and bright and full of species that Mercer had only ever seen through the scope of a rifle, and he found it strange to be standing among them without armor, without a weapon, without anything between him and them except a treaty that was still wet with ink. He was reaching for a glass of water when a shadow fell over him, tall, angular, and sharp, in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Sub-Commander Rivik stood before him, one of Veltharis's military advisors, a Velkari warrior whose exoskeleton was darker than the others, scarred in places where the crystal had been cracked and regrown, and his 4 eyes studied Mercer the way a predator studies something it has not yet decided to eat. "You are the one they call Mercer," Rivik said, his voice like gravel scraping against glass. "That's me. I have read your file, Ember Ridge, the Kellen Offensive, the Siege of Orion's Gate. You have killed many of my kind." Mercer met his gaze without flinching. "And your kind killed many of mine." Rivik tilted his head, a gesture that might have been curiosity or contempt. "Your species bleeds so easily, your bones break, your skin tears, your bodies fail in ways that ours never would. How did you survive this long?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke, and Mercer could feel the weight of it, the challenge buried inside the words, the test that Rivik was running without even trying to hide it. Mercer smiled, not a wide smile, not a warm one, just a small turn of his lips that carried more history than any speech. "We bleed," he said, "we just don't stop." Rivik stared at him for a long moment, and then turned and walked away without another word, disappearing into the crowd like a blade sliding back into its sheath. Mercer watched him go and then looked down at his hand and realized it was steady, perfectly steady, and he did not know if that was a good thing or a bad thing anymore. The banquet ended late and the delegations retired to their quarters, and the station grew quiet in the way that places full of secrets always grew quiet, not with silence, but with whispers. Mercer did not sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bunk and studied the station's layout on his datapad, marking every corridor, every junction, every emergency exit, every place where a man could run and every place where a man could hide. And he told himself he was being paranoid, that Zhao was right, that peace required trust. But trust was a currency he had spent too much of in the HFY Wars and never gotten back. 3 decks below, in a sealed Velkari communications room that no human was ever meant to see, an encrypted transmission arrived from the Dominion homeworld of Kethvar, routed through 6 relay stations and scrubbed of every traceable signature. And the officer who received it read it once, and then deleted it, and then stood very still for a very long time. The message had been short. "The accord is the sheath, the blade remains drawn." Morning came to the Celestine meridian, the way it always did on a station with no sun. The lights shifted from dim blue to warm gold, and a gentle chime echoed through the corridors, and the recycled air changed from the cool stillness of night mode to something that almost smelled like fresh wind. And Commander Jonah Mercer was already awake, because he had never gone to sleep. He showered and dressed in his standard duty uniform and checked his sidearm out of habit, before remembering that weapons were prohibited on the diplomatic decks. So he locked it back in the case under his bunk and walked out with nothing but his boots and his instincts. The plan for the day was simple and symbolic. A joint tour of the station's new medical wing, built as a shared project between humans and Velkari, staffed by doctors from both species, meant to show the galaxy that the two civilizations could heal together the same way they had once hurt each other. Ambassador Zhao had designed the event herself, and she was proud of it, and Mercer respected that even if he thought the timing was too soon and the security was too thin. He met the human medical team at Junction 17 on Deck 9, 4 doctors and 2 nurses, all civilians, all smiling the nervous kind of smile that people wear when they know cameras are watching, and Mercer's job was to escort them through the lower corridors to the medical wing where they would meet the Velkari team, and the tour would begin. "Stay together," he told them. "Stay behind me, and if I tell you to move, you move without asking why." One of the doctors, a young woman named Priya with kind eyes and steady hands, laughed softly. "Commander, it's a hospital tour, not a combat mission." Mercer looked at her and almost smiled. "Best tour I've ever been on were the ones where nothing went wrong. Let's keep it that way." They moved through the corridors in a loose group, and Mercer kept his pace easy and his posture relaxed, but his eyes never stopped, checking every doorway, every intersection, every shadow that looked a little too deep. The station was old in some places and new in others, and Deck 9 was one of the older sections where the lighting was uneven, and the bulkheads had that slightly yellow tint that came from decades of recycled atmosphere, and Mercer did not like how quiet it was down here. The celebrations were happening on the upper decks, which meant the lower corridors were mostly empty, and empty corridors made the back of his neck itch. They reached Junction 22, and the bulkhead ahead of them flickered once, and then sealed with a heavy metallic clang that echoed through the hallway like a door slamming shut in a cathedral. "Maintenance cycle," one of the nurses said, "happens all the time on older stations." Mercer stared at the sealed bulkhead. "It's not supposed to happen on diplomatic lockdown. All maintenance cycles should be frozen during the summit." He tapped his comm. "Mercer to security, bulkhead 22 on Deck 9 just sealed. Can you confirm status?" "Static." He tried again. "Mercer to security, do you copy?" Nothing but the soft hiss of dead air. The itch on the back of his neck became a fire. "Everyone stay here," he said, and his voice had changed. It was not the voice of a man escorting doctors anymore. It was the voice of a Marine who had heard that silence before and knew what followed it. "Stay against the wall and do not move until I come back." He moved ahead alone, turning the corner past Junction 22 into a connecting corridor that should have been empty, and it was not. 6 Velkari soldiers stood in the corridor in full combat chiton, not the polished ceremonial armor of the diplomatic guard, but the matte black stealth plating of the Silent Blades, the Dominion's most elite killers, and every one of them had a weapon raised and pointed directly at him. For one heartbeat the corridor was frozen. 6 aliens in black armor and 1 human in a duty uniform with no weapon and nowhere to run. There was no warning, no demand to stop, no voice telling him to surrender. The first shot hit him in the left shoulder, and the world became white-hot pain and spinning metal and the smell of his own blood vaporizing against the energy bolt's heat. And the force of it threw him sideways into the wall so hard that the panel behind him cracked. The second shot came before he even stopped moving, a grazing line of fire across his ribs that carved through his uniform and the skin beneath it, and left a streak of red that looked like someone had drawn a line across his body with a burning knife. And then something happened that the Silent Blades had not planned for. Jonah Mercer did not fall down. He had been shot before. On Ember Ridge, a Velkari pulse round had punched clean through his thigh, and he had kept walking for 6 kilometers with his best friend's body over his shoulder. And a graze on the ribs and a hole in the shoulder were bad, but they were not enough. Not nearly enough. Not for a man who had been fighting things that wanted to kill him since the first day he put on the uniform. He pushed off the wall and moved forward, not backward, not sideways, not toward cover, forward, directly into them. Because the silent blades were trained to fight at range, and every step closer was a step into territory they did not own. The nearest silent blade hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for its 4 eyes to process the impossible sight of a bleeding human charging straight at 6 armed soldiers. And that fraction of a second was all Mercer needed. He grabbed the alien's weapon arm with both hands, one of which was slippery with his own blood, and he twisted with every ounce of strength and rage, and training that 12 years of war had burned into his bones. And the arm bent in a direction it was never meant to go, and the silent blade shrieked, a sound like breaking glass. And Mercer pulled the alien's body in front of him just as the others fired. 2 bolts hit the silent blade in the back, and the creature went limp in Mercer's arms, and he used the dead weight like a battering ram, shoving forward into the next soldier, and driving it into the wall. The corridor was too narrow for all of them to fire at once. That was the only reason he was still alive, and he knew it, and he used every inch of that narrow space like a weapon in itself. He slammed his elbow into the faceplate of the second silent blade, and felt the crystal crack beneath the impact, and the alien staggered, and Mercer ripped the weapon from the dead soldier's grip, and swung it like a club, because he did not know how to fire it, but he sure as hell knew how to hit something. The improvised strike caught a third silent blade across the jaw, and sent it spinning into the far wall where it crumpled, and did not get up. 3 down, 3 standing, and Mercer was bleeding from the shoulder and the ribs, and now from a gash on his forehead where a claw had caught him, and his vision was starting to narrow at the edges, but he could still see them, could still feel them, could still fight. He screamed, not a word, not a battle cry, just a raw sound that came from somewhere deeper than language, the sound of a species that had been fighting for survival since before it had a name. And the 3 remaining silent blades did something that no intelligence report had ever predicted. They stepped back. They looked at this bleeding, broken human who should have been dead 3 times over, and they saw something in his eyes that their training had not prepared them for, not anger, not desperation, but the absolute and unshakable certainty that he would kill every single one of them or die trying, and that either outcome was acceptable to him. The station alarms finally triggered, a screaming red pulse that flooded the corridor with light and sound, and the 3 silent blades made a decision that would haunt the Velkari Dominion for a century. They ran. Mercer watched them go, and then his legs decided they were done, and he slid down the wall, leaving a long red smear on the metal behind him, and he sat on the cold floor of Deck 9, surrounded by the bodies of 2 dead aliens and 1 broken one, and the violet ichor of their blood mixing with the red of his. His hand was shaking when he reached for his comm, but his voice was steady. It was always steady, even when everything else was falling apart. "Ambassador, this is Mercer. They broke the accord. I need medics at Junction 22, Deck 9, and you need to get to the ship now." Zhao's voice came back sharp with fear. "Jonah, what happened? Are you hurt?" "I've been better," he said, and then the comm slipped from his fingers because his hand was too wet to hold it. The doctors he had been escorting found him 90 seconds later. Priya was the first to reach him, and she pressed her hands against the shoulder wound and told him to stay awake, and he looked at her and said, "I told you, best tour are the ones where nothing goes wrong." She did not laugh this time. The station erupted into chaos. Security teams flooded the lower decks. The Velkari delegation was confined to their quarters. Ambassador Zhao was rushed to the Terran shuttle under armed guard, and every news network in the galaxy began broadcasting the same breaking alert. The Accord of Tranquil Stars had been broken less than 24 hours after it was signed. The Valkyrie released a statement within the hour, calling the attack the work of rogue elements acting without authorization, and expressing deep regret and commitment to the peace process. Nobody believed them. As Mercer was loaded onto a medical shuttle, blood still dripping through the pressure bandage on his shoulder, the Terran Confederation's military channels lit up with a priority transmission that reached every fleet, every station, every ship, every marine barracks on every world that flew the blue flag. The message was short and it contained no emotion, and it needed none. They fired on one of ours. He is still alive, awaiting orders. 14 hours later, the largest fleet mobilization in human history was underway. The footage was not supposed to get out. It was recorded on Mercer's duty collar camera, a small device no bigger than a button that every Terran military officer wore as standard equipment, and the recording was classified the moment it was pulled from the medical shuttle, marked eyes, only for the Confederation Security Council, sealed behind encryption so heavy it would take a supercomputer 1,000 years to crack. It stayed classified for exactly 6 hours. Nobody ever found out who leaked it. Some said it was a junior analyst who could not stomach the idea of the galaxy believing the Valkyrie's story about rogue elements. Others said it was someone much higher up who understood that the truth was a weapon more powerful than any fleet. And some whispered that Ambassador Zhao herself had authorized the release because she knew that peace built on lies was no peace at all. However it happened, the footage reached the galactic networks, and within 1 hour it had been viewed by more beings than any other recording in the history of interstellar civilization. The video was shaky and raw and ugly in the way that real violence is always ugly. It showed Mercer turning a corner and seeing the 6 silent blades, and in that frozen moment before the first shot you could see his face, and there was no confusion there, no shock, just a terrible instant of recognition. The look of a man who had always known this was coming. Then the shot hit his shoulder and the camera jerked and spun, and the audio was nothing but the crackling thunder of energy weapons, and the wet sound of impact and Mercer's breathing fast and ragged, but never panicked, never screaming, just the controlled rhythm of a man managing his own pain the way he might manage a piece of faulty equipment. And then the part that made the galaxy stop breathing. The moment when Mercer pushed off the wall and charged forward, bleeding and broken and utterly alone, and the sound he made when he grabbed the first silent blade, that raw human sound that had no translation in any alien language because no other species had a word for what it meant. The Rithik Combine played the footage in their public squares, and their children watched in silence, and the amphibian elders said nothing because there was nothing to say. The Thessari Collective, a species of empaths who could feel the emotions of other beings through recorded media, reportedly had to shut down their viewing centers because the emotional intensity of the recording was causing physical distress among their population. And on 100 worlds in 100 systems, beings who had spent their entire lives thinking of humans as the galaxy's newcomers, the soft, short-lived species that had stumbled into the stars barely 3 centuries ago, watched a man with a hole in his shoulder kill 2 elite soldiers with his bare hands and looked at each other, and did not say what they were all thinking. Which was, what have we been underestimating? Aboard the Terran carrier TCS Unyielding, Admiral Cora Vasquez watched the footage alone in her quarters, and she watched it only once because once was enough. Vasquez was 63 years old and she had commanded warships for 30 of those years, and the lines on her face told the story of every battle she had fought and every order she had given that sent people to their deaths. And she had a reputation in the fleet that was built on 2 things: her patience, which was legendary, and the absolute devastation she was capable of when that patience came to its end. She closed the footage and sat in silence for a long time, and then she called her senior staff to the bridge. Captain Torres was the first to speak. "Admiral, The Security Council has authorized a defensive posture. We can move the 7th Fleet to the border and establish a—" Vasquez held up one hand and the room went silent. "Is Commander Mercer going to live?" she asked. The ship's medical liaison checked his datapad. "He's in surgery aboard the station. The shoulder wound is severe, possible nerve damage. The rib wound is superficial, but he lost a significant amount of blood. It's touch and go, Admiral." Vasquez nodded slowly, and something shifted in her eyes that made every officer in the room straighten their spine, because they had seen that look before. Once, at the Battle of Candris Reach, right before she destroyed an entire Velkari attack fleet in 47 minutes. "Open a fleet-wide channel," she said. The comms officer obeyed, and the channel opened, and Vasquez's voice reached every ship in the 7th Fleet: 12 carriers, 38 destroyers, 91 frigates, and over 200 support vessels, crewed by 250,000 human beings who had signed up to protect their own. "This is Admiral Vasquez. By now you have all seen the footage from Celestine Meridian. Less than 24 hours after the Velkari Dominion swore peace, their silent blades attempted to assassinate Commander Jonah Mercer, a man who was unarmed, alone, and escorting civilian doctors to a hospital. He survived because he is the kind of man who survives, but he should never have had to fight in the first place." She paused and let the silence do its work. "We are moving to the Velkari border, not as an invasion force, not as aggressors, but as a wall. We will take position at every strategic approach point, and we will hold those positions until this matter is resolved. The Velkari Dominion will be given one chance to explain themselves in person aboard this ship, unarmed, and I suggest they take it." She closed the channel and turned to her comms officer. "Send the following to the Velkari Dominion on an open diplomatic frequency. Make sure every species in the galaxy can hear it." The message she dictated was read by every news network within the hour. "You swore peace, you fired on one of ours without warning. We are not declaring war. We are giving you one chance to explain in person, aboard our flagship, unarmed, why we should not." The galaxy held its breath. Meanwhile, on the Celestine Meridian, Mercer lay on a surgical table while human and, ironically, Velkari medical equipment worked to repair his shattered shoulder. And the surgeon, a veteran named Dr. Akefer who had operated on soldiers since the early days of the HFY Wars, said later that what struck him most was not the wound itself, but the scars he found beneath it. Mercer's body was a map of every battle he had ever fought: pulse burns on his back from Ember Ridge, shrapnel marks across his legs from the Kellen offensive, a long, thin scar on his neck from a knife fight on a station not so different from this one. And Dr. Akefer said it was like operating on a man who had been dying by inches for 12 years and simply refused to finish. The surgery took 9 hours. During those 9 hours, the galaxy watched and waited, and something began to happen that no diplomat had planned and no military strategist had predicted. The footage of Mercer's fight became more than evidence of a broken treaty. It became a symbol. On the neutral world of Thesson Prime, a Rithik ambassador approached the Terran embassy and said simply, "We did not understand your kind before. We are beginning to." On the trade station Meridian's Crossing, a group of Venari merchants, a species known for their strict neutrality, quietly canceled a shipping contract with the Velkari Dominion and rerouted their goods through Terran space. And in the halls of the Galactic Forum, where 100 species debated the fate of the galaxy, Ambassador Zhao stood before them and played the footage one more time, and when it ended, she said only this: "This man was escorting doctors. He had no weapon. He was not a threat to anyone, and they tried to kill him on the same day they swore they never would. You can believe their story about rogue elements. Or you can believe your own eyes. We are not asking you to choose sides. We are asking you to remember what you just saw the next time someone tells you that humans are the soft ones." Several species delegations quietly left the chamber after that, not in protest, but to make urgent calls to their own military commands, because a new calculation was being made across the galaxy, and it had nothing to do with the Velkari, and everything to do with the simple, terrifying math of what humanity was capable of when provoked. Back on the Unyielding, which was now cutting through subspace at maximum speed toward the Velkari border, Admiral Vasquez received word that the surgery was complete and Mercer was in recovery, and she allowed herself one small breath of relief before returning to the tactical display that showed her fleet moving like a closing fist. At some point during the long night that followed, Mercer woke up in the station's medical bay with tubes in his arm and bandages across half his body, and a dull ache in his shoulder that he knew from experience would become a sharp one when the painkillers wore off. A nurse was checking his vitals and she startled when his eyes opened and she said, "Commander, you should rest, the surgery was." "How many did I get?" he asked, and his voice was rough and dry but clear. She blinked. "I'm sorry." "The silent blades, how many did I get?" She hesitated and then checked her datapad. 2 confirmed dead, 1 in critical condition with a fractured exoskeleton, 3 escaped. Mercer closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose, and when he opened them again, they were hard and bright and full of something that the nurse would later describe to her colleagues as the most frightening calm she had ever seen in another human being. "Not enough," he said. And then he closed his eyes again and slept, and the galaxy kept turning, and the fleet kept moving, and somewhere on the Velkari homeworld of Kethvar, the beings who had ordered the assassination of Jonah Mercer were beginning to realize that they had made a very serious mistake. The throne room on Kethvar was not a room at all but a cavern, a vast underground cathedral carved from living crystal that had been growing for 10,000 years, its walls pulsing with a faint violet light that matched the heartbeat of the world itself. And at the center of that cavern, suspended on a platform of black stone that floated above a chasm so deep that no light had ever reached its bottom, sat matriarch Silkithra. She was old, older than Veltharis, older than the treaty, older than the war itself, and her crystalline body had been cracked and regrown so many times that it no longer caught the light cleanly, but instead scattered it in jagged patterns that made her look like a thing that had been broken and rebuilt from its own pieces. Which was exactly what she was. Silkithra was the true power behind the Velkari dominion. Archon Veltharis signed treaties and made speeches, but he did so at her command, and every silent blade answered to her before they answered to anyone else, and the order that sent 6 of them into that corridor on Deck 9 had come from this cavern, from this platform, from this ancient and calculating mind. She had not ordered the assassination of Jonah Mercer because she wanted war. She had ordered it because she wanted information. The attack was a probe, a test designed with surgical precision to answer a single question that the Velkari had been asking about humanity since the first day the 2 species met. How do they break? Every species in the galaxy had a breaking point. The Rithik folded under economic pressure. The Thessari collapsed when their empathic bonds were disrupted. The Venari abandoned allies the moment profit margins shifted. And Silkithra had spent decades studying humanity the way a scientist studies a specimen, looking for the crack, the fault line, the weakness that would tell her how to control them. If the humans responded to the assassination with grief and diplomacy, it meant they valued peace above pride, and the Dominion could slowly push into their border systems over the next century, taking one colony at a time, always just below the threshold that would trigger a real response. If the humans responded with blind rage and immediate attack, the Dominion could fall back behind their fortified border, paint humanity as the aggressors, and rally galactic support for a defensive war that would drain human resources for generations. Either way, the Dominion won. That was the plan. And for the first 12 hours after the attack, Silkithra had felt the cold satisfaction of a strategy unfolding exactly as designed. The humans were angry, yes, and the footage was spreading, yes, but these were expected variables, accounted for, managed. Then the reports started coming in. Matriarch, her intelligence chief said, standing at the base of the platform with his 4 arms pressed tight against his body, in the posture of extreme deference that Velkari adopted when delivering bad news. The Terran 7th Fleet has mobilized. Admiral Vasquez is moving to the border with full carrier strength. So Kithra waved one claw dismissively. Expected, they will posture and make demands, and eventually they will negotiate. How long did the mobilization take? The intelligence chief was silent for a moment too long. How long? She asked again. 14 hours, matriarch. The cavern seemed to grow colder. So Kithra leaned forward on her platform, and the crystal beneath her groaned softly. That is not possible. A full carrier fleet cannot reposition across 3 sectors in 14 hours. Our fastest mobilization requires 6 standard days. I have confirmed it with 4 independent sources. The entire 7th Fleet departed from 3 separate staging areas and converged on a unified formation at the border in 14 hours. Their subspace drives operated at speeds we did not know they were capable of. So Kithra said nothing for a long time, and the silence in the cavern was the kind of silence that made her advisors afraid, because the matriarch was never more dangerous than when she was quiet. What else? She asked finally. The intelligence chief swallowed, a wet clicking sound that echoed in the crystal chamber. They have not attacked. They have not issued an ultimatum. They have taken position at every strategic approach vector along our shared border, and they are holding. Admiral Vasquez sent an open diplomatic message demanding that we send a delegation to explain ourselves aboard her flagship. An open message, so Kithra repeated, so every species heard it. Yes, matriarch, every species heard it, and 47 governments have already issued statements calling for full transparency from the Dominion. This was not in the plan. Grief or rage, those were the 2 paths she had prepared for, the 2 human responses that her centuries of study had identified as the most likely, and she had countermeasures for both. But the humans had chosen neither. They had chosen something that Silkithra did not have a word for in her own language, something that sat exactly between fury and restraint, a response that was simultaneously a closed fist and an open hand, and she did not know what to do with it because she had never seen it before. Over the next 48 hours, the situation grew worse in ways that Silkithra had not anticipated. The humans did not just park their ships at the border. Admiral Vasquez opened humanitarian corridors, inviting journalists from neutral species aboard her vessels to tour the fleet and see for themselves that humanity was not preparing for war, but preparing for the possibility that war might be forced upon them. And the distinction was subtle but devastating, because it put the entire moral weight of whatever happened next squarely on the Dominion's shoulders. Vasquez broadcast Mercer's recovery in real time, not classified footage this time, but a voluntary feed from the medical bay on Celestine Meridian, approved by Mercer himself, showing a man with a bandaged shoulder doing physical therapy, exercises with his damaged arm, gritting his teeth against the pain, refusing assistance from the medical staff, getting up every time his body told him to stay down. The galaxy watched a single human being put himself back together with nothing but stubbornness and will, and they watched the fleet that stood behind him with enough firepower to burn a civilization to glass, and they watched that fleet do absolutely nothing except wait. And the message was clear without anyone having to say it. We could end you, and we are choosing not to, and the only question left is whether you are smart enough to understand what that means. On Kethvar. So Kithra's advisors began to fracture. Some wanted to launch a preemptive strike before the humans grew stronger. Others wanted to surrender immediately. Others wanted to maintain the fiction of rogue elements and hope the galaxy's attention span was short enough that the crisis would fade. So Kithra listened to all of them and dismissed all of them, and spent one full day alone in the crystal cavern, thinking. She thought about the footage she had watched, not the version the galaxy saw, but the raw, unedited version that her intelligence service had intercepted, the version that included the audio of Mercer's breathing and the sound of his boots on the metal floor as he charged 6 armed soldiers with nothing but his hands. And she thought about the look in his eyes in that frozen moment before the first shot. She had studied 1,000 species across 1,000 years, and she knew what fear looked like in every form it could take: the cold paralysis of the Rithik, the frantic scattering of the Venari, the desperate empathic projection of the Thessari. And what she saw in Mercer's eyes was not fear. It was recognition. He had known what was coming, and he had not been afraid of it. He had been ready for it, the way a species is ready for something when it has been fighting its entire existence, when survival is not a hope but a habit so deeply ingrained that it operates below conscious thought. And that was the moment Silkithra understood the mistake she had made. She had been asking how humans break. The answer was that they don't. They bend and they bleed and they lose and they grieve and they rage, but they do not break. Not because they are strong in the way the Velkari are strong, with crystal bones and armored skin, but because somewhere in the twisted evolution of that impossible species, breaking had simply been removed as an option, deleted from the code, replaced by something that had no equivalent in Velkari biology or culture. The human word for it was spite, and Silkithra did not fully understand it, but she understood enough to know that she could not beat it. At hour 71 of the 72-hour deadline, Matriarch Silkithra boarded a shuttle alone and unarmed and flew to the TCS unyielding, and her advisors watched her go with the expression of beings who were not sure they would ever see her again. Ambassador Zhao was aboard the unyielding when the shuttle docked, and she stood beside Admiral Vasquez on the bridge and watched the small Velkari vessel pass through the fleet like a single leaf falling through a forest. And Vasquez said nothing, but her officers noticed that she had not taken her eyes off the tactical display for 3 days, and that the coffee cup on her armrest had been refilled 17 times. 3 decks below the bridge, in the observation lounge that looked out over the assembled fleet, Commander Mercer stood with his arm in a sling and his hospital gown still on, because he had refused to change and refused to stay in the medical bay, and the doctors had learned that arguing with him was a waste of time and energy. He watched Silkithra's shuttle dock through the observation window, and the fleet stretched out behind it, warship after warship after warship, their hulls catching the starlight and burning with it, and he thought about the last time he had seen this many human ships in one place, which was at the Battle of Orion's Gate, which was the worst day of his life. A nurse approached him cautiously. "Commander, you really should be resting," the doctor said. "The doctor can tell me that himself when he's been shot twice and still has things to do," Mercer said, and he did not take his eyes off the shuttle. He watched it settle into the docking bay, and he stood there for a long time, alone in the observation lounge with the stars and the ships and the ache in his shoulder that was a reminder of every promise that had ever been broken. "Let's see if they can keep their word this time," he said, to no one in particular, and then he turned and walked toward the door, because whatever happened next, he intended to be in the room when it did. They did not take her to the brig. That was the first thing Matriarch Silkithra noticed, and it unsettled her more than chains ever could have. When her shuttle docked and the airlock opened, she expected armed guards and restraints and cold metal rooms, because that was what the Velkari would have done. That was what any rational species would do when the architect of an assassination walked willingly into the heart of their most powerful warship. Instead, 2 officers in clean uniforms greeted her with a nod and escorted her through corridors that were wide and bright and filled with the sounds of a living ship. Voices calling to each other, boots on metal, the hum of systems working as they should, and Silkithra realized with a slow creeping discomfort that they were not afraid of her. Not because they did not know who she was or what she had done, but because 400 warships surrounded this vessel, and 250,000 humans crewed those ships, and every single one of them knew exactly who she was and what she had done, and they had decided that she was not a threat. Being ignored by prey was an insult. Being ignored by a predator was a warning. They took her to the medical wing. She understood the message before the doors opened. Admiral Vasquez wanted the first thing she saw aboard this ship to be the man her soldiers had tried to kill, wanted her to stand in the room where he was healing and see with her own eyes the cost of what she had ordered. And it was a move so precise and so deliberate that Silkithra felt a grudging respect for whoever had planned it. The doors opened and there he was. Commander Jonah Mercer stood in the center of the room, not in a bed, not in a chair, standing with his left arm in a sling and bandages visible beneath the hospital gown he had refused to change out of, and bruises on his face that had turned the particular shade of yellow-green that meant they were healing but not healed, and a line of surgical tape across his forehead, where a claw had opened his skin to the bone. He looked like a man who had been through something terrible. He looked like a man who was still here. Silkithra stopped in the doorway, and for the first time in more years than she could count, she did not know what to say. She had prepared speeches and arguments and justifications and counter-accusations, because that was how power operated, that was the game, and she had been playing it longer than this man's entire species had been alive. Mercer looked at her. And then he did something that broke every model she had ever built of human behavior, something so unexpected and so fundamentally alien to everything she knew about warfare and power, and the dynamics between the strong and the wounded. He pulled out a chair for her. "Sit down," he said, and his voice was hoarse and quiet and carried no anger at all. "You came a long way." Silkithra sat, because she did not know what else to do, and that in itself was a victory she suspected he understood. They were alone in the room, no guards, no cameras that she could see, no audience, just a wounded human and the alien who had tried to have him killed, separated by a small table and a silence that stretched like wire between them. "Did you think it would be easy?" Mercer asked. Silkithra tilted her head. "Did I think what would be easy? Breaking us, is that not what you were trying to do? I read intelligence reports too, matriarch. The attack was a test, the treaty was bait, and you wanted to see how we would react so you could plan your next move. So I am asking you honestly, one soldier to another, did you think it would be easy?" She considered lying and decided against it, because there was something in his eyes that told her he would know. And being caught in a lie by a man she had failed to kill seemed like a poor way to begin. "I thought it would be informative," she said. "And was it?" "More than I wanted it to be." Mercer leaned back in his chair and winced as his shoulder reminded him of what had happened. "Let me tell you something about my species, matriarch, since your intelligence reports clearly missed a few things. We have been fighting things bigger and stronger and faster than us since we crawled out of the mud on a little blue rock on the far edge of an unremarkable galaxy. Predators with claws and teeth that could tear us apart, diseases that killed half our world, ice ages that buried our homes under mountains of frost, and each other, God help us, especially each other." He paused and looked at her with those steady, quiet eyes. "Every single time something looked at us and thought we would stop, thought we would give up, lie down, die quietly, except that we were outmatched, and every single time. We did not because we are brave, not because we are strong, but because we are stubborn in a way that has no bottom, no floor, no limit. You can take everything from us and we will build it again. You can burn our worlds and we will find new ones. You can kill us and our children will come for you. Not because we want to, matriarch, but because we do not know how to do anything else." Silkithra was quiet for a long time after that, and the silence in the medical bay was different from the silence in her crystal cavern. It was warmer, and it was heavier, and it carried the weight of something she did not have a name for. "Your species frightens me," she said at last, and it was the most honest thing she had said in centuries. Good, Mercer replied. That means you are paying attention. 1 hour later, the formal negotiations began in the Unyielding's main conference room. Admiral Vasquez at the head of the table, with Ambassador Zhao on her right and Mercer on her left, still in his hospital gown, still in his sling. And Silkithra sat across from them alone because she had come alone, and that was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she had ever done. Vasquez laid out the terms with the same calm efficiency she used to plan fleet movements. Full public admission that the attack on Commander Mercer was ordered by the Velkhari Dominion leadership and was not the act of rogue elements. Complete military withdrawal from the 3 contested border systems of Ashara, Kellen's Reach, and the Ember Ridge Corridor. Permanent human monitoring stations established in Velkhari space to ensure compliance. War reparations paid not in resources or currency, but in the names of every Velkhari official who approved the assassination order, entered into the galactic public record for all species to see for all time. Silkithra's crystalline exoskeleton hummed with agitation. These terms are designed to humiliate us. These terms are designed to ensure this never happens again, Zhao replied, and her voice was iron wrapped in silk. Humiliation is what you chose when you fired on an unarmed man the day after swearing peace. Silkithra pushed back. If we admit to ordering the attack, it will destabilize our government. Internal factions will seize the opportunity to. Vasquez raised one hand and the holographic display behind her activated, filling the room with a 3-dimensional map of the Velkhari border. And on that map were dots, hundreds of them, each one a Terran warship, and they covered every approach vector, every supply lane, every strategic choke point like stars in a constellation designed for a single purpose. Matriarch, Vasquez said, and her voice was almost gentle in a way that was more frightening than any threat. You are looking at the 7th Fleet, which has been at your border for 3 days. What you may not have noticed are these. 3 new clusters of dots appeared on the display, massive formations that dwarfed the 7th Fleet, positioned at the far edges of Velkhari space, in places that should have been unreachable in the time since the crisis began. The 3rd Fleet arrived 36 hours ago, the 9th Fleet arrived 24 hours ago, the 12th Fleet arrived this morning. Your intelligence service detected none of them until 6 hours ago. The room was very quiet. 4 fleets, Vasquez continued, over 400 warships moved into position across your entire border in 3 days. We mobilized them while broadcasting Commander Mercer's recovery to the galaxy, while opening humanitarian corridors for journalists, while Ambassador Zhao addressed the Galactic Forum. We did all of this at the same time, Matriarch, because humans are very good at doing many things at once, especially when we are motivated. She leaned forward, and the light from the holographic display caught her eyes and made them burn. We are offering you terms because Ambassador Zhao believes in mercy, and because Commander Mercer believes in second chances. I believe in being thorough. You will not get a 3rd chance. Silkithra looked at the display for a long time, at the 400 ships that surrounded her civilization like a hand closing around a throat. And then she looked at Mercer, who sat quietly in his hospital gown with his arm in a sling, and she thought about what he had said in the medical bay about a species that does not know how to stop. She signed the terms. The broadcast of her public admission was transmitted across every galactic network simultaneously. The matriarch of the Velkhari Dominion, standing before the galaxy, and admitting that her government had ordered the assassination of a human diplomatic officer on the same day they swore eternal peace, and the names of every official involved scrolled across screens on 100 worlds, entered into the permanent galactic record where they would remain until the stars burned out. The response was seismic. 3 neutral species formally allied with the Terran Confederation within the week, not because they were asked to, but because they had done the math and decided that standing beside humanity was safer than standing anywhere else. And 6 more species quietly opened diplomatic channels that had been closed for decades. The Velkari Dominion withdrew from the 3 border systems as agreed, and human monitoring stations were built on the edge of their space. And the peace held, not because of trust, not because of goodwill, but because the galaxy had seen what humanity looked like when it was patient, and what it was prepared to do when patience was no longer an option. 6 months later, Commander Jonah Mercer stood on the balcony of the new Terran embassy on Vashar Prime, watching the sun set over a city that had been neutral ground for 100 years, and now felt like something closer to home. His shoulder ached in the cold evening air. It always would, the doctors said, nerve damage that no surgery could fully repair. And he rolled it slowly, feeling the pull of scar tissue beneath his uniform, the permanent reminder of a corridor on Deck 9 and a promise that was broken before the ink was dry. Ambassador Zhao stepped onto the balcony beside him, carrying 2 glasses of something amber that caught the last light of the setting sun, and she handed him one and stood beside him in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had been through something together that words could not adequately describe. "Do you think it will hold?" she asked after a while. Mercer looked down at the courtyard below the balcony, where a group of children were playing, human children and Velkari children together, part of a cultural exchange program that Zhao had designed and fought for and built from nothing. And the human kids were laughing, and the Velkari young were making that crystalline chiming sound that was their version of laughter. And they were chasing each other around a fountain that had water from Earth and crystal from Kethvar, flowing together, in patterns that neither species could have created alone. He watched them for a long time, and something in his face softened, not much, because Mercer's face was not built for softness, but enough. "It'll hold," he said, "not because they fear us, because now they know what we're willing to do for peace, and what we'll do if someone tries to take it away." Zhao smiled and raised her glass, and he raised his, and they drank together as the stars came out one by one over Vashar Prime, and somewhere out among those stars the 4 fleets of the Terran Confederation patrolled the borders of known space, quiet and watchful and ready, always ready. 100 years later, a galactic historian from the Thessari Collective published a comprehensive account of what came to be known as the Meridian Incident, and in the final chapter, she wrote a passage that would be quoted in classrooms and academies across 1,000 worlds for centuries to come. The Velkari made the same mistake every aggressor in human history has made. They confused humanity's desire for peace with an inability to wage war. They fired on a single human without warning, and in return, humanity reminded the galaxy, without firing a single shot in anger, why the old Earth saying endured across 10,000 stars and 10,000 years. If you want peace, prepare for war. And in the archives of the Terran Confederation, filed under the permanent record of Commander Jonah Mercer, decorated veteran of the HFY Wars and survivor of the Meridian Incident, there was a personal note added to his file by Admiral Cora Vasquez herself, written on the day the terms were signed, short and simple, and carrying more weight than any treaty ever could. "He bled, he did not stop, none of us ever do.